Hello, and welcome to a multifaceted conversation that will be released on many different places. So I'm super excited about today's interview. I'm Natasha Parker. I'm the host of Mormon Mental Health Podcast. I'm also the host of Mormon Sex Info. And with me, I've got John Dehlin, who is the host of Mormon Stories Podcast. So we're going to have a really interesting discussion today about his research, specifically with gay and lesbian members of the church, I think primarily, maybe bisexuality. We'll talk a little bit about whether or not his research covers that, and mixed orientation marriages. So lots of really interesting things I'm very excited to talk to him about. And this is my first time doing a recording as a host on video. So that's exciting as well for those of my Mormon Mental Health listeners and Mormon Sex Info listeners. So maybe I'll do more of this if I get feedback that you like this format better. Just a few announcements before we get started. So for those of you who follow Mormon Mental Health Podcast, please, I was asking for donations. We did meet our kind of base goal for financial support this year in 2018, which allows me to survive into 2019, but it's never too early to start helping the 2019 efforts. And also lots of more things I could be doing, such as offering video interviews, things of that nature, if we make a little bit more than just our base goal. So please consider a donation at mormonmentalhealth.org. Those of you who are Mormon Sex Info listeners, please consider a subscription to that podcast. It's only $35 a year, and that helps support the work and all the effort I do to get really great people to come onto that podcast. We have lots of wonderful kind of nationally and internationally renowned professionals and also personal stories on that podcast. So it's all very much based on sexuality and the intersection with Mormonism. And those of you who follow John Dehlin obviously support him and his work at Mormon Stories. So without further ado, I would just like to introduce my friend and colleague, John Dehlin. Many of you do know him as the host of Mormon Stories, but believe it or not, he is quite more complicated than that. He's not just a podcast host. He's actually a clinical psychologist. Some of you know that. But he's also been published and done quite a bit of research. And I don't know that a lot of people know that about you, John. So, and it's kind of impressive. I mean, to be published in any of these kind of journals that I'll be mentioning here in a minute takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. And I'm guessing a lot of this you did throughout your Ph.D. journey. So he's been published in journals such as the Journal of Counseling Psychology, Journal of Sex and Marital Therapy, Journal of Gay and Lesbian Mental Health, and there's actually several others. So welcome to the program, John. So nice to have you.
Thanks, Natasha. You do great work. We've been partners collaborating for a long time. I am a big fan of Mormon Mental Health Podcast, of Mormon Sex Info Podcast, of all the good work you do. You're probably the top person I refer to as a marriage and family therapist, as a sex therapist, as a human, as an expert on faith crisis. And so it's an honor to continue our partnership. And, I have talked about this research before. The TED Talk I gave was based on this research. This was the research for my dissertation. I think 10 journal articles or so, maybe 8 have come out of this research. But Mormon Stories listeners have heard us talk about it before. But, a couple things. One is I'm sure a lot of new listeners have not heard us talk about it. And then no one's ever heard you and me talk about it. They've heard me talk about it. But you've got a lot of frontline expertise actually counseling LGBT Mormons in mixed faith marriages, LGBT Mormons who have attempted celibacy. And so there's going to be a boots on the ground, gritty materialism to this conversation that I don't think has been shared before. So that's what maybe listeners can be in store for today.
Yeah, I think this will be a great discussion. I'm really excited about it. And you're absolutely correct that, right away, I mean, and I've talked a little bit about my career on your podcast and such that, I started having mostly gay men and mixed orientation marriages show up in my practice, not so much lesbian Mormons or bisexual Mormons at that, 20 years ago when I first started, over 20 years ago. And so right away, I was faced with kind of having to face my own biases, my own ideas, as an LDS therapist myself, and looking at research, looking for resources. And there wasn't a lot out there. There was hardly anything out there, especially on mixed orientation marriages. So That's why I think this work that you've done is just so important. And I plan to have a follow-up, hopefully, podcast with some researchers that took some of your data and did another study for mixed orientation marriages. So that will be forthcoming, hopefully. All right, so why don't we get started just by you telling us a little bit about how you got into this interest? What out of all the things that you could have studied or had interest about, why this?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. So this was a very personal thing for me. Growing up in Texas, and growing up on Spencer W. Kimball and the Miracle of Forgiveness and the church education system kind of stuff, I was raised to think that being gay was dirty, that being gay was sad, wrong, sinful, perverted, loathsome, evil. All that rhetoric that Boyd K. Packer and Spencer W. Kimball shared, I bought well into college at BYU and on my mission. The first sort of real experience I had, other than knowing some kids at high school that I suspected were LGBT, was having a few of my cousins come out as gay while I was a BYU student. And Daniel Parkinson has become a very well-known supporter, advocate for LGBT Mormonism, specifically to try and prevent LGBT suicide. But he's a psychiatrist who's been involved with affirmation. And you will read on Rational Faith some blog posts that he co-authored to help raise awareness about the LGBT Mormon experience. He also was the original host of Gay Mormon Stories Podcast, which isn't active right now, but there's still a catalog of a lot of good interviews there. So when Daniel and his brother Sam came out as gay, that was the first, it's like, whoa, I have some gay family members. That's weird. And then they moved across the country and you never heard from them again, or at least for many, many years. And I always thought that was sad. The second brush I had with it was when I'm at Microsoft. Actually, let me go back. I made a kind of a homophobic comment in a work setting while I was working in Chicago around 1995-ish. And one of my colleagues turned to me and said, "Have you ever known a gay person, John?" And I'm like, "Well, not really." And he said, "Well, actually, you have. I'm gay." And that was this. I was so shocked and embarrassed that I had said something kind of insensitive. It wasn't homophobic, but it was insensitive. And he called me on it. And then he was so loving that he taught me about his life and his partner's life. And it really humbled me. Then I went to work for Microsoft. And in 2000, I got the news story of Stuart Mattis walking up to the steps of his local LDS church, pinning a note to his chest that said, "Do not resuscitate," and he took his own life. And that was like, oh my gosh, our gay people are killing themselves. I had no idea. And then my wife Margie's cousin Scott came out to us as gay before he even came out to his own parents, and in that conversation told us he had suicidal thoughts. And all that history just made it so when I started Mormon Stories Podcast, LGBT stuff was amongst the first stuff I covered, because I knew by 2005 that the church had this one wrong. Now, when I started I'll just say one more thing. When I started Mormon Stories, Evergreen was still very much thriving, which was this reparative therapy organization that the church always had either a general authority or former general authority be on the board of directors. The Evergreen International Conference every year would usually be held on church property. And then all the LDS Family Services people would be referring LGBT Mormons to Evergreen, which meant that they were referring them to reparative therapy therapists and Journey into Manhood retreats and all these sort of unscientific, extremely damaging resources for LGBT people that would basically say to them, your being LGBT is a function of bad parenting. It's a function of sin. It's a function of choice. It's a function of sexual abuse. It's a function of not being manly enough or having the right role model. And so, up until I did this research, Evergreen was thriving. Reparative therapy in Mormonism was thriving. And, the church had this really awful, toxic approach to its LGBT members. And so when I finished my master's thesis on scrupulosity, which is religious OCD, I thought, well, I got to do a dissertation. What's a topic that will mean something? Because I'm certainly not going to just do a 200-page dissertation that never gets published and nobody reads. And so Bill Bradshaw reached out to me at that time, who is a much beloved former mission president, former stake presidency member, and lifelong biology teacher at BYU. And he said, John, there's a lot of talk about reparative therapy. There's a lot of rumor. There's a lot of dialogue and debate, but there's no data. And so he said, will you partner with me on a study? And so I took that to Utah State University with my advisor, Renee Gallagher, who's never been Mormon. And we decided to do a study where we would survey as many LGBT Mormons and post-Mormons as we possibly could to ask them about things like reparative therapy, sexual orientation change efforts, celibacy, mixed orientation marriages, church activity, so that we could actually have data to inform this discussion, not just rhetoric.
Yeah, and that really mirrors my experience. Back in the day when I first started, I was a contract worker for LDS Family Services. So I remember I had a mixed orientation marriage and I had a gay kind of single adult. Those were my first two kind of clinical cases. So of course I called up my supervisor, what resources do you have? And they sent me all this material that was pretty much put out by the church that mirrors a lot of what you just mentioned. And one thing I don't think that you mentioned in that was relationship with parents. So it kind of posited this idea that the mother would be an overbearing mother in these situations. That was part of what created kind of like blaming mothers for homosexuality, and also distant relationships with fathers. So parents have been blamed for a lot of diagnoses, schizophrenia and all kinds of things throughout the history of psychology, unfortunately. But this was definitely still happening, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, that these types of messages. So as I was reading through those materials, which, I even at the time, I was like not comfortable with the materials that I was reading. It felt like, where are they getting this data from? How do they know these are the things that are contributing factors to homosexuality, et cetera? And pretty quickly I started realizing, it wasn't evidence-based standard of care type of materials. And Evergreen was very popular. I know both of these men that I was seeing were involved with Evergreen even before coming to see me. So they had been referred to that organization, I'm guessing through bishops or other therapists that they had seen. And it was interesting too to see the church kind of say, oh no, we're not in charge of Evergreen, right? That's not our organization. But to your point, this is kind of how they kind of get to talk out of both sides of their mouth sometimes by saying, no, we didn't found the organization. We're not organizing the organization, but we're on their board, or we support, or we refer to, or we, have LDS Family Services, refer to it all the time. So it's one of those things that can be confusing to the public. Like, is it or is it not affiliated with the church? So it definitely was. It definitely was affiliated with the church, as are, relationships with other types of organizations even today with different issues like pornography addiction, things of that nature. So that continues to happen. Fight the New Drag, for example, all these kinds of organizations that have a lot of support from LDS energies, let's say. So yeah. Were you going to say something? Did I?
True.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk then a little bit about the data. How do you collect the data? How do you collect the sample? Who's interviewed for this? And how do you go about having a random sample, which is usually something you want for research?
Yeah. So if it's okay, I'll share this PowerPoint presentation that I developed around my research, and then we'll stop me at any time and we'll have a dialogue about it.
Okay.
Is that all right? So can
Yes.
you see? Okay. So what we did, I'll just begin by saying that this study was conducted by 4 people: Dr. Bill Bradshaw, biology professor at BYU, tenured, lifelong professor, former mission president, faithful guy. Renee Gallagher, professor at Utah State University, specializing in matters of identity and sexuality. Me, and then another grad student named Katie Krull. There were a couple of questions.
Well, going back, it said 1600.
Oh yeah, I'm going to talk about the sample.
Okay, because that's a big number.
Oh yeah, huge number.
Yeah, mm-hmm.
Yeah, we'll talk about that.
Okay.
So the main questions we asked were: are sexual orientation change efforts or reparative therapy, are they effective or are they damaging? Because there was not a lot of data. Second was, how do LGBTQ Mormons navigate their identity? What works and what doesn't? And then the third was, what decisions lead to optimal health and well-being for LGBTQ Mormons versus and former Mormons versus sort of really poor outcomes. And
so right away, I'm going to ask a question, and I hope this is not off-putting, but one of the things that I've been called on quite a bit is using the term LGBTQ, which is kind of what we use kind of as an umbrella term. And yet each one of those letters symbolizes an entire population, right? That's very kind of unique. I mean, a transgender population is very different from a lesbian population. Some of them intersect, like you can be a trans lesbian, things like that, or a bisexual intersex person or something along those lines. When you really think about this data that you did, do you think that you really studied each one of those letters, or was it more about gay and lesbian Mormons?
So here's where it's, first of all, you're bringing up a super important topic. Here's where we are fitting that acronym, and here's where we're not. We collected data from LGBTQ Mormons. So the data that we're going to be talking about, there are lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transgender people, and people who identify as queer, along with people who identify as heterosexual and people who identify as same-sex attracted. Mm-hmm. In other words, the study reached out to anyone who has experienced same-sex attraction and at some point has been Mormon in their life.
Okay.
And so now what you're not going to find is data analyzed from a bisexual standpoint or from a trans standpoint. We have that data. It is still available to be analyzed that way. And in fact, if there was a budding grad student or even professor that wanted to take our data and analyze it from the bisexual standpoint or from the trans standpoint, they could do that. But this represents any respondent who is 18 years or older, has been baptized Mormon at some point, and has experienced same-sex attraction, and that fits across all those different identities. Was
there any measure on where they were on the spectrum of Mormonism at the time of the survey?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, we definitely asked, and they rated themselves either active, inactive, disfellowshipped, excommunicated, or having resigned. Those were the 5 options. And then we also definitely did measures of religiosity to see how intensely religious they were. That was part of it.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. I love it.
Questions.
Jump in anytime.
Okay.
All right. So our primary design goal was to have a very large and diverse sample because, up until this point, there wasn't a lot of studies. This is actually worth talking about. So prior to this time, research scientists, let's just say who are more secular in their orientation, weren't interested in reparative therapy because, frankly, it was viewed as harmful and abominable and backwards. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, had depathologized being homosexual, as they called it, back in the early 70s. And so for the medical community and for the mental health community, for the most part, this was a done deal. It was fine to be LGBTQ. There was no problem. You should do it. And it wasn't pathologized. And so in that sense, it wasn't necessarily a domain of interest for researchers. Where it did become a domain of interest was religious institutions wanted to basically promote the idea that sexual orientation could be changed. So you would get evangelical Christians, Orthodox Jews, Catholics, Mormons, all getting together and saying, hey, we've got this LGBT problem, but we can fix it. If you'll just go to this therapist or go to this reparative therapy camp or go to this Journey into Manhood weekend, we've got therapists that will reorient your sexuality and fix it. But, they knew that just by saying that could be problematic. So what you would get is these researchers that were religious and their research was motivated by religion. And they would do these little studies where they would bring a bunch of people to a reparative therapy camp, hand them out a survey and say, hey, okay, you just had this weekend, how's your sexuality? Did we help change it? And the problem with those studies, and there were several, is that they weren't random. They weren't randomly distributed. They didn't even make an attempt at random distribution of the survey. They would literally just say, okay, who's a reparative therapy doctor or therapist? Let's have them submit this survey to all their patients. Or let's go to a reparative therapy conference and let's have all the people who attended the reparative therapy conference fill out the survey. And so the samples were small, the samples were biased, the samples were skewed only towards people that would be more inclined to say that their sexual orientation had changed as a result of the therapy or the conference. And so you will find several of those studies. And they were.
And I will say too, just to add to that, I will add that, in working with a lot of people who did attend Evergreen or these types of retreats that you're talking about, I did have several clients who attended Journey into Manhood type of retreats. They would come back from those sessions. And again, this is at a time when I was kind of open. I was kind of like, well, if you think you can change your orientation and you want to try those things, go ahead and try it. Come back and report what your experience was to me, and we'll, see what happens. And typically what would happen after those types of experiences, what I would notice my clients doing is that they almost became homophobic themselves. It was really interesting to see kind of like what you call internalized homophobia, where they would come back and be very it was kind of shocking. Like I was like, well, but you struggle with this and you're talking about people who struggle with this very demeaning and very belittling ways. And they'd be very kind of convinced and almost like evangelicized, like, oh yes, I can do this. I can do this. And then it wasn't until about 6 to 9 months later, typically, that would kind of come crashing down in our sessions. And they would say, you know what, I can see now that I was really invested in that idea. I was really trying to make it work. I was really trying to convince myself that it would work. So to your point, if they're giving out these studies at the end of this retreat or this little, weekend experience that they've had, I think that even the people themselves who are filling out the surveys might sincerely think that they've experienced some type of change that isn't going to have a long-lasting effect. So I just wanted to put my own experience into that.
That's great. And there was this groundbreaking, there were a couple of groundbreaking moments in the history of kind of the reparative therapy movement. One was when this guy named Robert Spitzer, who is a well-respected psychiatrist, comes out with an article, a journal article that he couldn't get any respected journal to publish. So he published it in some backwoods journal, basically claiming all these people had changed their sexual orientation through reparative therapy. And that was used by Evergreen and People Can Change and all these organizations for years, Exodus International. Spitzer's article was used to justify these reparative therapy camps. Later, almost on his deathbed, Spitzer acknowledged that the methods he used for the study were flawed, and he renounced his own study. And that was one. But then also, there was the leader of this massive evangelical reparative therapy organization who, after he was done spending decades promising change, admitted that 99% of the people that went through his program did not, in fact, have their sexual orientation changed. And so
and those things happened fairly recently, right? Like in the last 10 years, I would say.
Yeah. In the past 10 years.
Because I remember both of those things happening.
But see, it's important to understand that the study that we did with Bradshaw and Gallagher was before all that stuff had come out. So we were in the middle of a battle trying to defeat reparative therapy. Right. Before all these things.
We're still in a battle. I mean, it's still a legal form of, therapy in many, many states. It's starting to become illegal for minors in several states, but it's still practiced all the time. And also, I just want to remind the audience, this is why, when we use terms like peer-reviewed research, that might, I don't know, you may not really care about that, but that's why it's so important, because you can find articles, you can find quote unquote research, but peer-reviewed research and peer-reviewed journals is where you're going to find the type of information that has been checked for research flaws, that has been duplicated, that has been looked at by a body of professionals that say, yes, they've met the parameters for a study to be considered legitimate. And that's why it's very important to know whether or not the stuff you're reading comes from peer-reviewed sources.
Beautiful.
Okay.
And so that was back to the presentation. That was our main design goal, was a large and diverse sample. We were not interested in cherry picking only post-Mormons that hated reparative therapy, only people that we could use to prove our, the side we wanted to show. We simply just wanted the largest sample we could get, as diverse as we could get it, and then see what the data show. And that's good science. And so what we did is we created this online study with, 200 questions, very long study. And then we were able to get Jennifer Dobner of the Associated Press to write an article advertising our study. And so this study went out in over 100 newspapers worldwide. And we went to every known LDS LGBTQ support group, including Evergreen. Mm-hmm. So in other words, we went to and I'll just be honest, I wasn't a big fan of reparative therapy before this, but I was even more motivated to be honest about our methods because I wanted good science. I didn't want our study to be undermined as being bad science. And so we actually made 3 direct outreaches to Evergreen and North Star to say, hey, you guys are pro reparative therapy. Give this survey to everyone who's ever been through your program. We don't care. We just want the truth. We're not trying to stack the deck. And this is something that was some really creative thinking that no one had done before. And so by having this study show up in 100 newspapers across the world,
was North Star and Evergreen open to helping you?
There are representatives from Evergreen and North Star who filled out our study.
Okay, yep. Great, thank you.
But Evergreen did not want to participate. They were hesitant to participate, and they were reluctant, and I don't know how fervently they participated because I don't think they wanted, the data. They didn't want to see the outcome. That's my opinion.
Yeah.
And of course now they're defunct. They've folded and they've disappeared because they're not really a credible organization.
Right.
They were a harmful organization. But anyway, we went overboard to recruit them. And the good news is we got 1,612 people to complete this survey. And this is not just the largest survey of LGBT Mormons ever conducted. This is the largest survey ever of LGBT people who have been through reparative therapy. The only ones that even come close, there was a People Can Change study in 2007, which was not published, which had 224. Of course, I mentioned the Spitzer study in 2000, which Spitzer denounced. That only had 200, and it was only recruited from pro-reparative therapy organizations. And then there are a few others that were like 100, 150, 98, 37. Those were the sample sizes of the studies prior to our study.
Right.
So I was super proud of that. We were proud of that. And then, we actually asked our participants where they heard about our study. 39% heard about it through word of mouth, email, Facebook, 22% through the LGBT support groups that we reached out to, 22% heard about it through news articles and web search, etc., 11% blogs, websites, internet forums, and then 6% through non-religious support organizations. So a lot of participants from a wide variety of different sources.
Okay.
Demographics, it's always good to kind of get a sense for who filled this out. It was 75% male and 22% female. That's a weakness of the study. We only have theories on why it was so predominantly male. It could be that many females who are LGBT just don't think of themselves as LGBT. They think of themselves as low libido or asexual or sexual. What's that?
Especially Mormon women.
That's all this is.
Yeah, right. So,
talk about that, Natasha. Would you have a theory as to why 75% of our respondents would be male and so many women wouldn't?
Well, there's several theories. I mean, we're male-centric around sexuality issues anyway. We talk about homosexuality as a male issue in the church. And then to your point, the way we talk about sexuality with women, especially in a Mormon construct, is that they're fairly much, the gatekeepers and kind of the protectors of their own sexual purity and virtue. And I've had actually many clients, like I told you at first, I would see gay men and I was like, well, do we not have lesbians? Why are lesbians not showing up in my practice? And over time, I've actually had quite a few lesbians, and the typical presentation is that she is married heterosexually, comes in as low libido, not necessarily enjoying sexual, life with her husband, although usually in a very good relationship with her husband otherwise, friendship wise and parenting wise and those kinds of things. And as she starts possibly considering orientation as an aspect to why she's experiencing low libido in a heterosexual marriage, it's like the onion layers come back and like this blooming person comes out and all of a sudden her sexuality is like very front and center. And I'm like, oh, okay, we're, this is what we're dealing with, is a lesbian orientation, not low libido issues. But a lot of times women, I don't think Mormon women are not as tuned into that in adolescence or young adulthood because they're not taught to really tune into their sexuality to begin with. So it's all about the male. It's all about my relationship with the male. It's all about me getting married, Mormon identity, motherhood, all of that stuff. And so when they finally get to a point where they're going to focus on their own sexuality, it's like, oh my goodness, I'm in a totally different boat than the boat I'm on. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's so helpful for you to validate what we have had.
That's my anecdotal experience.
Yeah. No, it's important because I think a lot of women didn't fill out this survey because they possibly were LGBT, but just thought of themselves. They've never explored their identity, because we know sexuality with women from the research of Lisa Diamond. We know that sexuality for women is more fluid, that women tend to have more prevalence of bisexuality than sort of this monolithic, either straight heterosexual or straight gay.
Right.
And then women in Mormonism just aren't considered sexual beings so oftentimes. We know that through the work of like Jennifer Finlayson Fife and others, where their job is to please their man, and they haven't even thought about their own pleasure or their own needs. And so I think these are some of the reasons why women didn't even think of themselves as LGBT and thus wouldn't bother to fill out a survey on LGBT issues, because they didn't think of themselves as same-sex attracted, because they'd never allowed themselves to even open that Pandora's box.
Yes.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Okay. So the mean age of our sample was 37 years old. It was 91% white because that's Mormonism, at least in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
We did have 48 states covered, 22 countries, 45% of our sample is from Utah. And then our respondents were higher than average income and education. And these are just some of the demographics that it's important to show when you're talking about your sample.
Sure.
Okay, so in terms of relationship status, 42% of our sample reported as being single. This was pre the legalization of same-sex marriage. So LGBT people didn't have the option for marriage in most states. So 42% identified as single, 35% in committed same-sex relationships, 16% in married heterosexual relationships or mixed orientation marriages, 4% identified as divorced. 63% identified as gay, 14% as bisexual, 14% as lesbian, 6% heterosexual, 3% same-sex attracted, and trans doesn't belong in there. So that shows our ignorance, or my ignorance as a researcher at the time. There we go. I'm putting trans in as a sexual orientation, and it is not. And I'm just noting my blindness and ignorance at the time. I'm embarrassed that that's there, but that's what the slide was back when I made this presentation. So I'll own it.
Yeah.
There is a difference between sexual orientation and gender identity.
That's right.
It shows how far we've come, frankly.
Absolutely. Yes.
Interestingly, a third of our respondents were active in the church. So for those who want to say this was a biased sample that didn't include, that were just angry post-Mormons or whatever, that's wrong. 30% identified as active in the church, 36% inactive, 25% had resigned, 7% had been excommunicated, and 3% disfellowshipped.
That's a fairly high number of resigned members. Do you think that's because people are avoiding disciplinary actions?
Well, yeah, I mean, at the time,
sample.
Yeah, at the time, I think for many, it's a sign of empowerment. We've seen resignations increase within the post-Mormon community, and the faith crisis sort of, situations over the past few years. I think LGBT people, just for a long, long time, for decades, have been opposed to the church's rhetoric, opposed to the treatment of their own people, and resignation is just a form of empowerment. If you've lost touch with your bishop, your stake president, you're living somewhere else, you're not engaged with the church anymore, you just resign. That's how you get your name off the records. It's the way you get the church to stop harassing you. It's the way you get the home teachers to stop showing up. It's the way you get the church to stop.
Well, and I'm guessing specifically for the LGBTQ community in Mormonism, it might be a reason to resign, which is maybe not so much so for the rest of us, would be to avoid disciplinary action, because quite frankly, they're at a higher likelihood of being called in for discipline if they're quote unquote, living the lifestyle, which is one of the ways that Mormonism talks about people being in same-sex relationships. So I'm wondering, it's just something I'm wondering about, not something I'm expecting you to answer.
Absolutely. Okay, so back to the data. Let's see, I'll share it now. So let's see. Okay, so now it's time to sort of jump. This was really interesting. This is a slide Bill Bradshaw came up with. There's some developmental milestones that we tracked along the way. We asked them questions like, when did you first have a sense of being different than others? When did you start feeling, same-sex orientation? When did you first become attracted to people of the same sex? And so you're going to see mean ages for men and women here. So we have men on average reporting that by 9, on average, they're feeling different than themselves and others, and women by age 11. Men by age 13 are realizing that they're same-sex attracted. Women by the age of 16. So women are having that awakening a little bit later than men on average. Men don't have, on average, their first same-sex or romantic experience until 18 on average, and women 21 on average, or 22. And they don't disclose their same-sex attraction until 21 for men and 23 for women. And for those of you who track Mormon history, you'll know that 21 was the age that men usually finished their missions. And so the common narrative for men was deny your same-sex sexuality, maybe have a little bit of experimentation before, but go on a mission, serve your mission, go on the mission being promised that if you go on a mission, your same-sex sexuality will disappear. They go on the mission, they serve faithfully. Oftentimes they're APs on the mission, super valiant. Then they get home from their mission and they realize that it doesn't go away. And same thing for women. And it's by that point that they're at BYU or BYU Idaho, Rick's or whatever, where they go to a therapist for the first time. And it's usually their therapist that they come out to, or their bishop or stake president. And so those are some of the milestones. And then finally, how long did it take until they actually were willing to label themselves with an LGBTQ identity? It was 22 for men and 24 or 25 for women. Now, I'm guessing that these milestones would look very different in 2018. We have kids coming out much earlier. Mm-hmm. We have people talking about it to priesthood leaders or therapists much earlier. We have people self-identifying as LGBTQ earlier. And all that's, I think, positive for mental health.
Yes. Yeah. And also to just note that LDS leaders, Bednar in particular, have discouraged LGBTQ members from labeling themselves, right? So that whole idea of don't label yourself as something so negative instead of really understanding the importance of self-identity and being able to own a label that, matches your self-identity.
Right. And you even have Bednar saying there is no such thing as a gay or lesbian Latter-day Saint. Of course, right. They're getting really weird with labels these days in Mormonism. And,
yeah.
Yes. But I think
we're having a few label issues, branding issues.
The good news is with movies like Believer, with Mama Dragons, mm-hmm. With Mormons Building Bridges, Affirmation, Gay Mormon Stories, all the different podcasts, you're seeing LGBT Mormon pride show up, and you're seeing parents embracing their LGBT kids coming out with Samantha, kids coming out with their LGBT identity younger and younger. And I don't think the church is winning that battle.
Well, not to mention that Utah was the first state that we had
to legalize same-sex marriage.
Yeah, to legalize same-sex marriage. It's amazing.
In the more modern era of legalization.
Yes.
There were a few states like Massachusetts or
yes,
wherever that
right.
had it.
Yes.
But yeah, so a lot of positives have happened since this study and other things that have happened. But okay, so those are some developmental milestones. Now we'll just jump right into the data. So the first question that we wanted to cover was, okay, we've got all this reparative therapy going on. Is it working? Is it helping people?
Mm-hmm.
And we basically we identified, let's just say 10 different ways that people attempted sexual orientation. And this was one of the most innovative and important approaches of the study. We knew that people attempted to change their sexual orientation through going to a therapist or through going to these, group retreats, right? What has never been talked about and never studied prior to this study ever in any religion, in any context, were other methods that people use to change their sexual orientation. The most obvious being personal righteousness, prayer, fasting, serving in the temple. And so we asked, do you use personal righteousness as a way to change your sexual orientation? We also asked, are there other individual efforts that you use? Do you go to your bishop or your stake president or your mission president to try and change your sexual orientation? And so we asked about 10 different types of methods: group therapy, group retreats, family therapy, psychiatry. And what we found is that the top 3 most common methods of attempting to change your sexual orientation were never discussed and never ever researched before. 76% of our respondents tried to change their sexual orientation through personal righteousness, prayer, fasting, etc.
It's a Mormon equation, right? It's like if you're righteous, then you will be blessed. And Yep.
55% tried through other different individual efforts, and they could choose more than one, right? Most people on average attempted in at least 3 different methods.
What's an example of other individual efforts that
would be reading books, browsing the internet, talking to friends.
Okay.
So just anything you would do on your own that wasn't through righteousness or talking to a therapist or going to a group or a counselor, those sorts of things.
Gotcha.
But third on the list was church counseling. Mm-hmm. So that's talking to a bishop, talking to a stake president, talking to a mission president.
Which we know how much training they have on LGBTQ sexuality, orientation, identity.
And they had even less then.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Right.
It's hard to go less than none, but somehow, anyway, I'm being a little bit...
No, I don't think it's glib. I think it's hugely problematic that this is where people feel like they're getting expertise from.
Yeah.
I think it's unethical. I think it's really harmful.
Yeah, it is. Only a third of our respondents had attempted sexual orientation change efforts through psychotherapy. But that's egregiously high because it's against the ethical code of pretty much every major mental health organization. So whether it's psychiatry, the medical profession, psychologists, marriage and family therapists, licensed clinical social workers, counseling psychologists, all of them at one point in their history or another had declared sexual orientation change efforts unethical and, damaging. And so the fact that within the Mormon context in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, and even today, there are still therapists doing different forms of reparative therapy, even as low as 35%. It's still egregious, right?
And not to mention that BYU was doing shock therapies and research and things like that all the way into, I think, the late 80s, if I remember correctly, which again was post the diagnosis change in the DSM, which, like you said, happened in the 70s. And this is a big reason why I founded, with the help of several other professionals, the Mormon Mental Health Association, right? So because it is always fascinating and egregious to me how many mental health professionals really allow for their own religious bias to interfere with clinical standards of care. It's a huge problem, not just in Mormonism, but in Christian counseling and evangelical counseling. And I say that as, a Mormon therapist. I've had to call myself on a lot of that. And it's fascinating to me how many professionals and colleagues of mine really struggle with that issue. And I've actually been speaking about that at several universities, and we'll be speaking on that at a university in Wisconsin tonight. So
awesome.
It's a problem.
Huge problem.
Huge problem.
Still is a problem. Still is a problem. Okay, here's probably the most important slide in the reparative therapy discussion. What we did is we asked, how did you experience your efforts? Well, we asked, which efforts did you try? How many years did you try each effort? And did you experience it as harmful or not effective or ineffective, right? Or highly effective, right? And for those of you who are watching on YouTube or on Facebook who have the visuals, what you'll see is something really, really alarming. You'll see some methods that were not used very frequently and, did not then contribute to a lot of harm. But what this survey shows is that the most prevalent methods used for reparative therapy were also used for the longest amount of time and were the most damaging. So the method, by far the worst possible way to change your sexual orientation, was through personal righteousness. Unfortunately, 76% of our respondents attempted that method on average for 11 years. And you'll see that 80% rated it as either harmful, severely harmful, or ineffective. And we had a lot of these narratives of people saying, I prayed, I fasted, I served, and I got to the point where I was suicidal because God wouldn't fix me. He would claim, there'd be these people standing up in these conferences like North Star or Evergreen saying, God fixed me, God changed me, who turned out to be secretly still engaging in sexual behavior. And they were just either lying or, they relapsed, but they still were willing to hold themselves up as role models for all these other people that then tried to follow their example. And then when they did for 10, 11 years, they became suicidal because they said, I must be beyond God's power. I must be so broken, so defective, beyond God's power, beyond God's love, that God will fix all these other people, but they won't fix me.
That's right.
And so that's why personal righteousness is the most evil and pernicious of all forms of sexual orientation change efforts, followed by individual efforts, which were practiced for 9 years, not quite as harmful, but still harmful. And then look at that, church counseling. 47% attempted church counseling with bishops and stake presidents for an average of 6.6 years. And again, 80% declared it as either ineffective, moderately harmful, or severely harmful. And let me just talk about ineffective for a second. Okay, well, as long as it's not severely harmful or harmful, it's okay because it's just ineffective. But what if you put your entire life on hold for 10 years, instead of dating LGBT youth as a youth, instead of dating LGBT people as a teen and in college, instead of getting into committed, loving same-sex relationships as a young adult and as an adult, like so many, heterosexual people get to do, these respondents would go well into their 30s, never having a healthy, emotional, and sexually intimate relationship with anyone. And so you're putting your life, not only are you postponing those really important years and you're losing them to the opportunity to have intimacy and relationships, you're also not getting those really important formative relationships, just dating, flirting, playing around sexually, learning healthy sexual behavior. And that's what's led to all these, LGBT men and women that would go to San Francisco or wherever and just get thrown into really unhealthy, underground, toxic, forms of sexuality instead of the relatively healthy, normal sexuality that a youth or a young adult would experience just in, above ground, not underground, day-to-day normative living. Now I should pause and let you jump in there, Natasha.
No, I totally agree. And I think this has lifelong repercussions. It has developmental repercussions. How many people I've heard in my office talking about, I'm in my 30s now. I feel like I'm 15 as far as a sexual person. I have very little experience. I don't know how to date. All of my, colleagues and peers are completely in a different realm of their own experiences. I feel like an idiot, so much pain. And, we talk about suicidal statistics because obviously, LGBT populations, skyrocket in suicidal statistics compared to heterosexual statistics. But even outside of suicidality, I just want to say, even outside of that, even if you haven't gotten, to the point where you're suicidal, this is so severely damaging to just life, lifestyle, life projection, self-esteem, self-confidence, relationships, relational health, sexual health. You don't need to be quote unquote suicidal to have a problem here, So I just want to really, I don't think anybody escapes this type of upbringing or narrative or kind of context that you're very well providing without severe, ramifications for their entire lives.
Yeah. And we should also mention that just, gay, lesbian, bisexual prevalence rates are around, as I understand it, 5%. So we're not talking about a small number. If there are 16 million Mormons across the world, whatever 5% of 16 million is, but it's not a small number. It touches everybody. And if you,
it's millions of people. Yeah.
And if you include people who have experienced same-sex attraction, even if they don't identify as LGBTQ, or who have had some sort of same-sex sexual encounter, it goes up to 10 or 11%. So it's a very large percent that's affected in all sorts of horrible ways by these practices.
Right.
Yeah.
And even though your study is focused on Mormonism, I can imagine a lot of correlates here with evangelical, Christians, that there's going to be a lot of similar results.
Jehovah's Witness, Scientologists, Orthodox.
Yeah, so when you start looking at that Catholics, type of population, we've got millions and millions of people who are affected negatively in this way.
All the non-affirming LGBT religions. Islam, let's not forget Islam, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so the takeaway here is the religious attempts to change sexual orientation are the most damaging and the most prevalent. So the worst thing you can do to try and change your sexual orientation is pray to God, have faith in Jesus, and grasp the atonement, read your scriptures extra hard, go to the temple extra hard, serve your mission, and just be super, super faithful. That's the most damaging thing you can do, which is the opposite of what an untrained, unethical therapist would say, which is draw near unto the Savior, read your scriptures, pray, trust in the Lord. The Lord and the Savior will guide you through this challenge of your life. Well, they're basically leading you down a path of toxic, poor mental health and potential suicidality in the name of God and Jesus, which is, so it's counterintuitive because we all want to think, any engagement with God and the Savior is going to improve our mental health and well-being. I'm not against people having God and Jesus as a strong, important source of mental health. But when you embrace it in the context of trying to change your sexual orientation, when you embrace Jesus, the Bible, the Book of Mormon, religiosity in that context, it's a potentially fatal or deadly usage of religion.
Yeah. Well, and counselors shouldn't be using that type of language anyway. Therapists should not be saying, hey, pray to God. If they're going to bring in any type of spiritual language or thought, it would be more like, tell me about your spirituality, tell me about your religion. Is prayer something you find helpful? Why or why not? But to have it as an intervention is a completely inappropriate part of counseling and therapy. And then of course, back to your church counseling services, this is very much what ecclesiastical leaders would say. This just falls right in line with what they would say, because that's what they do have to offer, is pray and use these spiritual tools to help you with whatever problem you're bringing into the door. And they do that usually very well intentioned, very uneducated, and not understanding the harm that they're causing.
And that's one of the problems historically with LDS Family Services and, LDS Social Services, whatever they're called today. And I think the church is getting rid of that sort of thing altogether. But they have handpicked and cherry-picked the therapists that bishops and stake presidents and mission presidents will refer to based on their willingness to incorporate what I believe in many cases are unethical practices of interweaving, commingling religious standards with people's identity and with their psychotherapy
and with sexuality, which is again unethical. Like LDS Family Services stopped referring to me when I started talking about masturbation being a normative sexual developmental thing, which the American Pediatric Association has come out with for decades now, and so they're going to stop referring to me, a licensed clinical marriage and family therapist with no issues. Never been reported. I don't have any problems with my license or anything like that in the state of Kansas. But here locally, they will not refer to me because I do not, adhere to the church's idea of what correct mental health is instead of what the standards of care are for mental health. This is a huge problem that we're having.
So use Natasha or people she refers. That's my...
well, that's why we have the Mormon Mental Health Association. And I vet every single person on there to make sure that they're aware of these ethical concerns and we can trust to refer to them.
Absolutely. Okay. Now here's an even more stark slide. We talked about the prevalence rates and the harm and the time that people spend some of these narratives, by the way, some of these respondents went 30, 40, or 50 years trying to change their sexual orientation.
Yeah.
The average is just 10 or 20 years, but sometimes it extends well beyond. And there are men or women in their 60s finally coming out to their spouses as gay or lesbian. And just imagine what those lives often were like. Anyway, the message from this slide is religious attempts at change are the most prevalent, longest used, and the most damaging. So don't do it. The next slide was just overall effectiveness. And so we asked, how many of you eliminated your same-sex attraction, right? Because that was their goal. They went to same-sex, sexual orientation change, reparative therapy to make the gay go away, right?
Yeah.
And this was a really disturbing number on a couple levels. We found that 0% of our respondents, and that's about 1,000 who attempted sexual orientation change. So we had 1,600 fill out the survey, 2/3 of those that attempted sexual orientation change. Of the 2/3 who attempted change, 0% reported that they eliminated their same-sex attraction. Okay? Now, you don't want a number like 0% in a scientific study because it looks like you're cooking the books. You would at least expect 1 or 2 or 3 or 5%. And remember, 1/3 of our respondents were active believing Mormons, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You want a couple people or a small percentage saying that they eliminated their same-sex attraction. We found like 2 people who said that, but out of 1,000, that doesn't even register as 1%. So we have 0% reporting an elimination of the same-sex attraction. And if you think about that, well, let me say a couple more things. 3% reported some change in their sexual orientation. That means that their same-sex attraction decreased, right? Or their other sex attraction increased, but they still remained LGBTQ or, same-sex attracted.
On the spectrum, yeah.
But then 40% reported harm from their attempts at change. So imagine if reparative therapy were a drug that the FDA was going to approve. Mm-hmm. Imagine trying to get a drug approved by the FDA where 0% of the respondents reported that the drug achieved the goals that they had by taking the drug, and 40% of the people who took the drug reported harm with no positive benefit. Would the FDA approve that drug? Hopefully not, right?
Yeah, hopefully not.
Reparative therapy is that.
Yeah.
You were laughing. Why were you laughing?
Well, because it is so, that's just a great metaphor, right? It's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And this is where the intersection of mental health and religiosity is such an interesting and complicated space. Because obviously in mental health, we are taught in training, we are taught to respect people's religious values. If people come in with religious values, you're supposed to be comfortable enough to manage the thoughts and beliefs of your clients. And so when you have, for example, an entire religion taking a stance on something that really is more biological and medically kind of oriented, which is how we very much understand LGBTQ issues now, but they're looking at it from this religious lens, it becomes this very tricky space to know how to how to navigate as a mental health professional, right? So if somebody comes in and says, hey, my goal is to change my orientation because of my religious beliefs, and I don't want to be a homosexual, and I want to be able to get married to a heterosexual, and those are my goals, that becomes a very tricky space for me to be able to honor their religious values, but also give accurate standard of care, information. And these kinds of research, projects make that so much easier to be able to have this kind of data and to be able to offer psychoeducation in a way that is hopefully, still, I guess, what I want to say, respectful of people's religious beliefs. So when I critique and when I advocate towards the leadership, not towards the members, right? So it's the leadership of the church that should be aware of how harmful this is, because they are the ones that are prescribing the medication that you are saying is completely ineffective. And not only that, it's harmful. And so I hold the church leadership responsible for having this knowledge, for having this kind of understanding. This is not new. Like you've been saying, when did you do this study?
I think 2011.
Right. So it's been around for a while, and other types of studies have been around for a while around homosexuality. And yet they continue to not only give the prescription, but to double down on the prescription, to kind of even make it worse as they've developed some of their policies and developed disciplinary actions that need to be taken that continue to worsen the lifestyle for LGBTQ members. And so that becomes a very ethical debate about church leaders and their role in continuing to put forth a treatment per se that is actually harming other people. We would not be okay with that if it was about diabetes, right? Or heart disease, or if the leaders were saying, don't pay attention to your cancer specialists, instead, do essential oils, right? Or something like this. I think most church members would be up in arms about anything like that being said from the pulpit. And yet that's what we're doing in matters of sexuality, gender identity, and sexual orientation.
We have several listeners who are listening to us live that we want to give a few shout outs to. Shout out to Julie Steenbackers Johnson. She says, we love you guys. Starless says, I'm so glad that you both are helping millions, including me, open my mind to so many things. My heart is full. Catherine writes, I so resonate with what Natasha is talking about. I think that was when you were talking about, female sexual awakening and libido and asexuality versus same-sex sexuality. Eric writes, yes, there are psychologists still doing the reparative therapy. Just a few years ago, I saw an LDS psychologist who wanted to do this therapy. I left him in the dust. Good job, Eric. You made the right choice.
BYU Idaho just last year, or even at the beginning of this year, just had some type of reparative therapy group or something that was going to be taking place. So
yep, we got that.
It's alive and well.
We used Reddit to make that get canceled. But. Now, Jean Marie Todd offers a loving, I think it's a loving criticism. She says, this is such important work. It would also be good to have a discussion that includes actual LGBTQ people. That's true. Guilty. We should have done that.
Well, but I want to be very clear that this is not a panel discussion. So when I bring on panels, then yes, I am interviewing John as one of the main people who conducted this research study. That's it. So we've brought on lots of other, LGBTQ people. We need to do more of that. That's fine. But this particular interview I'm just interviewing you as one of the main people who conducted this study. That's it. So it's not a panel discussion.
Okay. And we appreciate that feedback from Jean Marie, because, it is a good practice wherever possible to always have members of the group you're discussing be a part of the conversation.
Yeah. And I think a good follow-up to this podcast would be maybe bringing on a panel to discuss, this research and how it affects them or how it resonates with them.
We should do that.
Especially since it's been, 10 years or more since you've done this research to begin with, 15 years. So, yeah.
Eric writes, they are talking about everything I have experienced to a T. And he says it was 20 years where he fought his same-sex attraction. Jean Marie also writes, I can't imagine how angry I would be to realize that bogus theories from my church had robbed me of my true identity for so long. I'm glad you figured things out. And then I'll just say one more. Comment. Okay, no, that's it. So those are some great comments from our listeners. There's just two quick things I want to say about this section before we move on to the next one. The first is that, to summarize the findings from the study, most LGBT Mormons attempt to change their sexual orientation because of their religion. Religious attempts are much more prevalent and harmful and longer in duration than therapist-led attempts to change. Overwhelmingly, the majority do not change their sexual orientation. In fact, pretty much none do. And then most feel harmed by the efforts. And those are the takeaways. And then the only other thing I want to say just historically is that, we don't know what the actual causes of this are, but as a result, let's just say after this research started getting published, all of a sudden Evergreen gets shut down. It transfers all its assets to North Star. So North Star becomes the new Evergreen. We've had people in the past talk about how North Star is just a different animal of the same thing, where North Star is encouraging cuddling parties where mixed orientation marriage couples will go to someone's house. The women who are all straight will all go to the upstairs and talk. All the men will go downstairs and they'll cuddle with each other and hold each other romantically under this bogus theory that holding a gay man will help you get your emotional needs met in a way to where you can then get that gasoline that you need to survive in a mixed orientation marriage. And of course, Journey into Manhood still thrives with Ty Mansfield and others. And all of this stuff is basically just broken theories, false theories. It's still holding on to these theories about broken parenting and sin and choice and abuse lead to same-sex sexuality. They're all assuming the religious belief that same-sex sexuality is wrong. And North Star is just a new face on the same animal of trying to change or manage your same-sex sexuality through righteousness. And but the good news is reparative therapy has been beaten back. Evergreen's died, and the church is no longer, at least openly and publicly, supporting efforts at sexual orientation change. They're now just doing it in a more backdoor, North Star, secret sort of unofficial way, but it's still being encouraged.
They're also not, my understanding is that the suggestion to go into a mixed orientation marriage has decreased significantly. So that used to be,
that's right,
30, 40 years ago, that was what was that's what the bishop would tell you. Well, just get married, to a nice young woman and it'll go away, or it'll figure itself out, or, things of that nature. So they're not doing that anymore. Right now, the options are really celibacy. I mean, they say.
Here's the thing, Natasha, and I would never want to ever disagree with you, but I'm just going to raise a point.
Yeah.
When LDS Living magazine puts Ty Mansfield and his wife on the cover.
Oh, I agree.
When North Star conferences that are given funding from church sources, when Ty Mansfield's given a book contract at Deseret Book called Voices of Hope, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
They are in effect encouraging mixed orientation marriages without explicitly telling people to do it, by holding up role models. And even when they came out with the Mormon and Gays website, they've got these couples where the gay person in a mixed orientation marriage is bearing their testimony about how they put their faith in Christ, and they've been able to have an awesome, loving marriage in a mixed orientation marriage on Mormons and Gays website. Several of those people who were promoted as proponents of mixed orientation marriages on Mormons and Gays were either at the time privately in same-sex relationships, or have since been in same-sex relationships, or have been divorced, or have left the church. Mm-hmm. And the same for the people that were advocating for celibacy. So we'll talk about celibacy and mixed orientation marriage in a second, but I just want to say that we should not think that just because the church isn't overtly encouraging mixed orientation marriages, which is an improvement, that they're not still promoting it and encouraging it and supporting it, because they absolutely are.
Yes, I would agree. And this, when we talk about mixed orientation marriages, which I'm guessing will be a different podcast because we're running out of time, it is this intersection of, and I feel this as a clinician, where I want to support those members who are in mixed orientation marriages. On the one hand, like I completely understand the context of what got them there. And many of them feel very, I think, betrayed by all sides of these discussions, right? Because like they'll listen to us, for example, and see us as not affirming of their relationships. They'll listen to people who, don't understand anything about LGBTQ plus issues, and they're not affirming either. It can be a very isolated, lonely place to be in a mixed orientation marriage. And at the same time, I can't ignore that the context of why they're in a mixed orientation marriage to begin with is largely religiously based. And we're going to talk about some of the issues with mixed orientation marriages. And so I'm hopeful that we can talk about that in a way where we're talking about data and we're talking about context and, again, standards of care and evidence-based, practice and research, which is difficult, I think, for those in mixed orientation marriages to listen to or to be aware of, because they don't feel like their particular situation is being talked about in a respectful way. So I just want to put that out there. I think that's just a very difficult relationship to be a part of. And, in your last little bullet point, you did say that some people did find some benefits to these types of approaches. And what I also want to say about that is that, for example, if you go to, like you've talked about, a cuddle party, which I'm not sure exactly that's how they would call that, but whatever they would call that, where you have these interactions with other people and you hold each other, you have experiential experiences. If I went and did that as a heterosexual, with the idea of bonding with other people, having an emotional, spiritual experience, I would probably find some benefit to that, because there's emotional connection, there's connection with other human beings. The point I think we're trying to make is that even though people may say that there are benefits to those types of experiences, they're not the types of benefits that really are being sold to begin with, which is sexual orientation change, right? And so you may go to for example, a reparative therapist and find a safe space. You may find a person who's very loving. You may find a person who's very accepting. Even though they're conducting therapy that is not research-based and evidence-based, there still might be some benefit to you going and having a person you can talk to and be open with about something you've never been open about in your life. So I just want to be very careful that we understand that just because there's a benefit doesn't mean, one, that we couldn't get that benefit from another place that is research, and evidence-based standard of care practice. And that the benefit is not typically what the goal is, that the benefit is just an emotional connection versus sexual orientation change, which is what a lot of these people are going into those services looking for.
And we also really should mention, and this came up in my interview with Chad Anderson, Gay Mormon Dad. This came up in my interview with Benji Schwimmer that I just released a week or two ago. Many of these cuddle parties or Journey into Manhood weekends where you do either cuddling with your clothes on, or I've even heard of these cuddling sessions with your clothes off, naked cuddling, with gay married Mormon men who are faithful and active in temple recommend holding, by the way. These practices that North Star and Journey into Manhood promote become these seeding grounds and these hotbeds for infidelity. In other words, yes, everyone goes with the idea of being faithful to their spouse, and they cuddle, and they, the idea and the theory is that we won't have any hookups or sexual arousal or activity. But what ends up happening is in the parking lot or the next evening, or, text, cell phone numbers are exchanged. And what happens behind the scenes is the hookup that comes after the cuddling. And from everyone I've talked to who's been involved in these sorts of things, that happens, and it's very common.
Yeah, and that would be expected. Again, you're looking at a population that is trying to desperately suppress a huge part of their identity, and now they're meeting other people who are in that same boat. Of course, you're going to connect with them. You're going to feel very intimate with them. They're going to understand you at a certain level that nobody else understands you, including other gay men or lesbian women, because like we've posited today, this is a very unique kind of population issue, not necessarily a gay men issue overall, right? And so I think it would be very common to connect with people and to make those kinds of connections that then become sexualized. So yeah, that's for sure. Okay, so John.
Yeah.
We got through a fourth of what I was hoping to, which is awesome because we had a lot of really good discussion. Can I invite you back to do part 2 of of your presentation.
You want to do that?
I would love to do that. And I
That's
also want to do...
That's not too much John Dehlin for your audiences?
I don't ever have too much John Dehlin. I'm one that my philosophy, just for those who care to listen, is that I am interested in people who, practice, like I said, evidence-based practice. And, I know a lot of people, and this just came up on my feed, I think yesterday. Oh, well, I have people that wouldn't want to listen to some of John Dehlin's podcast or something because he was excommunicated. Well, I am a big believer that, again, when I'm talking about Mormon mental health, I am not conducting an ecclesiastical interview to see whether or not somebody's clinical work is good enough to be on Mormon mental health. So Mormon mental health has active members and LDS therapists on it. It has inactive members and LDS therapists on it. It has excommunicated people like John Dehlin in it. And it has secular people who have studied, things that would affect the Mormon audience. So that's what Mormon mental health should be about, and not allowing ecclesiastical concerns to interfere with clinical, medical, or mental health practice. Just like I would hope that would be true of a plumber or an electrician or a dentist or any other profession, that they can be a good plumber whether or not they're excommunicated from any religion or not. So,
well, thank you.
Yes, I would love to have you back.
Oh, well, I would love to come back, and I'll just, there's other things we can talk about. We could talk about identity in the LGBT Mormon experience. We could talk about celibacy and mixed orientation marriages, and church participation. Does church affiliation with LGBT people lead to better or worse outcomes psychologically? For example, does celibacy work? Does it make you happy? Is it toxic? We can talk about, the benefits or the disadvantages of going inactive versus being excommunicated. And then you also want to talk about the understanding the Mormon faith crisis research that we did.
Yes, that's a whole different one. So yes, I also want to talk about mixed orientation marriages, because I do think, even though there are other professionals I will also interview about that, you had some data on that I definitely want to cover. So yes, I think we're probably looking at part 2 and part 3 of this segment that I'd like to get you back on. And then I would like to do the faith crisis research. It's actually been going around the internet without any conversation about who created that data. So we will do that. All right.
And I'll just end with a quote from Corey Linton, who's a listener. He says, there are still LDS leaders pushing same-sex attracted members to get married in a heterosexual relationship. I know personally of one from about 12 months ago. So I think that's just, Corey, thanks for the preview that these topics are still necessary to discuss.
Super, super necessary.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you, John, for being with me today. And I will make sure to get you on my schedule, because you're tough to get.
All right. You're awesome, Natasha. Keep up the great work. Listeners, donate to Mormon Mental Health Podcast. Your donations help to keep that podcast alive. Also support Mormon Sex Info Podcast, because Natasha is the best Mormon sex therapist around, period.
Well, I'm one of several really good ones. And there's Mormon Stories. So help support these efforts. We are very invested in psychoeducation. We're very invested in helping Mormons wherever they are on the spectrum to have good access to mental health information, especially here on Mormon Mental Health and Mormon Sex Info Podcasts. These are the intersection of faith, sexuality, sexual orientation, gender identity is a huge spectrum, and why I feel so passionate about it, and why I actually have to have different podcasts about it, because otherwise I talk about sex all the time on Mormon Mental Health, and that's not fair either. There are actually other issues. Okay. So thank you, John. We will convene and figure out some times when we can do this again.
Thanks, Natasha, and thanks, listeners.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks for your support. Take care, everybody.
Take care.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert each other's arms was as simple as I love you. An ordinary, extraordinary truth.
It's been a long road here, a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you. An ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary. It's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary. love.